On the windswept edge of Montana's prairie, a weary cowboy thought he had seen every cruelty life could offer. But when he followed a broken cry into a dry creek bed, he found them 3 foals on the brink of death, abandoned like worthless cargo. What began as a desperate rescue soon unraveled into something far greater, a battle against ruthless men, the rebirth of a forgotten legend, and a fight for the soul of the land itself. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind moved restlessly across the Montana prairie, carrying with it the bite of late autumn. It threaded through the tall grasses that had long since lost their green, bending, brittle stalks that rustled like paper under the weight of the season. A faint smell of dry hay and frost lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of cold earth. Overhead, the sky was a patchwork of gray clouds drifting low and heavy, leaving only narrow slits of pale gold sunlight that spilled onto the land like half-hearted blessings. Far on the horizon, the granite range loomed its stone shoulders dark with shadow, its peaks already kissed by the first stubborn traces of snow. Winter was coming. No one in Montana needed a calendar to know it. The sounds of the land were thin, but sharp of the groan of wind slipping through the row of poplars that marked the edge of the creek, the rasping caw of crows circling above the empty fields, and the distant creak of wooden beams that had stood longer than most men could remember. The prairie, once bursting with summer life, now seemed bare and skeletal, stripped to essentials by the season's unforgiving hand. A chill hung over everything, not yet the full force of winter, but the promise of it, and with it came the loneliness of open country, a silence that could weigh down a man's heart. At the bend of a shallow creek, now little more than a thread of water between stones, stood the remains of what had once been a proud ranch. Silver Creek Ranch had been raised in the last years of the 19th century, when cattle were plenty and hope was cheap. Its barns and fences had seen seasons of prosperity herds that once darkened the pastures and families gathered around warm hearths. Those days were gone. What remained was a cluster of weathered buildings with their paint long since surrendered to the sunboards bleached to the color of ash. The main house, though still upright, sagged at the roof line where snowstorms had carved their memory into the beams. The barn roof was a patchwork of rusted tin sheets that clattered against one another whenever the wind picked up. Fences leaned and split where posts had rotted. The once straight rails gaped open like missing teeth. An old granary stood at the edge of the yard, its doors hanging loose on hinges that screeched in protest whenever a gust pushed them wide. Mud and dead grass shared the yard in uneven patches, dotted here and there with thistles that had managed to root in the neglect. Yet even in decline, the ranch breathed. Smoke sometimes curled from the stovepipe when the night grew cold enough. The muffled sound of hooves shifted from the barn at dawn, and a faint, steady warmth seemed to linger beneath the decay, as though memory itself refused to let the place go entirely. Silver Creek Ranch existed half in the present, half in what it once had been. It was here that Ethan Ward lived. He was 38 years old, though hardship had carved years into his face beyond the number. Tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by decades of work and a back that carried more solitude than any man should. He stood like a figure cut from the land itself. His skin was the color of sun-worn leather, darkened by endless summers spent outdoors. He wore what had become his uniform, a weather-stained leather coat that bore the creases of countless rides, a pair of boots whose heels had thinned to near nothing, and a wide-brimmed hat that had long ago lost its proud shape. A rough beard shadowed his jawline, never more than a few days from the knife, and beneath the brim, his eyes held a gray-blue hue that spoke less of the sky and more of long winters endured without complaint. Ethan Ward was not a man of many words. People in town said he spoke less in a week than some men did in an afternoon. He did not laugh easily, nor did he share much of himself with those around him. But he was steady, and there was a certain dignity in the way he carried out his work. Every nail hammered back into a broken board, every trough refilled at dawn, every chore completed without fanfare. Ethan's life was a litany of small promises kept. He believed in finishing what was set before him, no matter how small. He had not always been alone. Years ago, there had been a wife, Anna, and a boy with hair like corn silk who had just learned to ride. They had died on a mountain road one winter. When the truck lost traction, a memory as jagged and merciless as the cliffs that claimed them. Ethan had sold most of his land in the aftermath, the debts heavy and his will broken, keeping only the core of the old ranch because he could not let it vanish completely. Since then, he had lived here in quiet exile, a man who spoke to no one but the land and the single horse that remained. That horse was Dusty. Dusty was a gray gelding, his coat the color of storm clouds marked by a thin scar across his left flank, a reminder of a barbed wire fence from years back. He was sturdy, not beautiful in the way of wild stallions, but loyal beyond measure. Where Ethan went, Dusty followed across the pasture into the hills, even down the dirt road to town when supplies were needed. There was no need for spurs or harsh commands. The horse knew Ethan's rhythm, and Ethan knew his. In the long stretches of silence, Ethan often spoke to Dusty, as though the animal could understand, telling him about weather, about chores, about nothing at all. Dusty would flick an ear or shift his weight as if answering. In truth, he was the only companion Ethan had left, and in many ways, the anchor that kept the man tethered to Silver Creek Ranch. Each morning began the same. Ethan rose before daylight, pulled on his worn coat, and stepped into the cold. He checked the barn spread what feed he had, and mended whatever had given way to age or weather overnight. He did odd jobs for neighboring ranchers, hauling fence posts, breaking ice from water troughs. Anything that paid enough to keep beans and coffee on the table. His meals were plain canned beans, stale bread, black coffee boiled strong enough to disguise its bitterness. Evenings ended with him at the stove, staring into the fire, as though it might one day offer back what it had taken. On this particular morning, the wind was sharper than usual. Ethan stood at the sagging fence line, one boot braced against the lower rail, his arms resting on the top slat. Dusty grazed behind him, tail flicking lazily against the cold. The land stretched out before them in shades of brown and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow before long. Ethan's breath hung in the air, each exhale a pale ghost that vanished as quickly as it appeared. For a long while, he did not move. His eyes traced the horizon where the granite range met the prairie, his mind lost somewhere between memory and the season ahead. The weight of solitude pressed against his chest, familiar, but no less heavy for it. There was regret for the family he had lost, for the laughter that no longer filled these fields, for the man he had become. There was unease too, born of the oncoming winter, and the knowledge that he had only himself to rely on. Dusty lifted his head ears, twitching toward the sound of distant crows. Ethan glanced at the horse and managed the faintest of smiles. He reached down, brushing his fingers against the animal's mane, and whispered, "Just you and me, old boy. Just you and me." The prairie gave no answer, only the whisper of the wind and the silence of a land waiting for something to break it. The day began, as so many others had before it, quiet, cold, and empty. Ethan Ward rose with the first smear of gray across the horizon, tugging on his worn coat, while the cabin still held the faint warmth of the stove he had stoked the night before. He boiled water in a dented tin pot, measured a scoop of bitter grounds into the kettle, and poured himself a mug of coffee so thin it was closer to ash than flavor. He drank without complaint, standing by the window, watching the breath of the land, rise in wisps of fog over the frost-bitten grass. When the cup was drained, he set it down, shrugged into his hat, and left the fire to smolder on its own. Dusty waited at the fence, stamping softly in the half-light. The gelding lowered his head to accept the rope ears flicking as Ethan tightened the cinch on the saddle. There was no need for words. Ethan swung into the seat and guided him north toward the stretch of fencing that had been sagging for weeks. That was his habit, to patrol the weak points to shore up what little could be shored to keep at bay, the wild things that pressed against the edges of his ranch. The air was damp and cold, the breath from horse and rider swirling in little clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Leaves brittle and brown crunched beneath Dusty's hooves, scattering across the trail. Ethan's face remained hard, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. This was routine, another day of mending, another day of silence. But silence has a way of carrying what it should not. Dusty halted abruptly, ears pricked, head cocked toward the dark tangle of trees by the creek bed. Ethan frowned, shifting in the saddle. He heard it too, a thin, fractured sound that barely rose above the hiss of the wind. It was not the sharp call of a crow, nor the rustle of deer in brush. It was a cry high and desperate, muffled as though it came from a throat too parched to give it strength. A second time it came, then faded, then returned again. Broken, urgent pleading. Ethan's body went rigid, his instincts tightening around him like a cinched belt. He had heard animals in distress before, but something in this sound, the raw edge of it, the fight inside the weakness, drew him like a hand on his shoulder. Without hesitation, he nudged Dusty off the trail. The horse obeyed, picking his way down a narrow track toward the creek. The bed had run dry months ago, the summer's drought, leaving nothing but stones and cracked mud. Thorny brush clung to its sides, and the ground was littered with branches, stripped bare by wind. Ethan guided Dusty carefully, the gelding's hooves slipping once or twice on loose rock. The closer they came, the sharper the cry became, until Ethan no longer needed to wonder. He saw them. At first, they looked like nothing more than fallen shadows against the pale ground, three shapes collapsed together amid the gray stones. Then one moved, a trembling of ribs, a shudder of a head, and the truth slammed into him. Foals, three of them. They were small, far too small to be alone, and no herd lingered nearby. Their bodies were twisted into themselves, legs curled awkwardly, as though they had collapsed mid-struggle. The sight struck Ethan like a fist to the chest. He had seen sickness, starvation, broken animals before, but never this. Not left like this. Not discarded. He swung down from the saddle, leaving Dusty at the rim of the creek. The gelding stayed still, ears still pricked forward, watching. Ethan approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, his breath clouding before him. The first foal stirred as he came close. Its coat was a dirty chestnut, the mane tipped red like fire, dulled by ash. Around its neck and chest were deep grooves, raw and angry, where rope had once bitten hard. The skin there was torn hair rubbed away, flesh bruised to a sickening purple. The foal's eyes were wide whites, showing each breath a harsh rasp that rattled in its throat. It tried to rise, legs jerking, but the strength failed, and it collapsed again, trembling so hard the stones beneath it shook. Ethan crouched beside it, swallowing hard. Blaze, he thought the name sparking unbidden. A flame still glowed inside this broken creature, faint but stubborn, waiting for air. Beside Blaze lay a smaller foal, her body thinner, frailer her coat, the pale brown of withered willow bark. Her legs were marked by burns patches, where skin was blistered and hair gone as though she had stumbled through fire. She trembled constantly, a fragile shiver that never stopped like a branch in ceaseless wind. Once she tried to push herself upright, front legs splayed, but they buckled beneath her, and she slumped back, gasping. Her eyes, dark, wet, terrified, lifted to Ethan's for the briefest of moments, and in that glance, he saw not only fear, but a desperate question, the faint glimmer of a plea. He whispered to himself, "Willow." It was the only word that fit her delicate, battered, but clinging to life. The third lay half apart from the others, his head twisted awkwardly, his sides heaving as though every breath might be his last. His coat was darker, streaked with sweat, and in the middle of his brow blazed a stark white mark shaped like a crooked star. What stole Ethan's breath were the eyes, one blue, one brown. They flickered open, then shut, then open again, unfocused but strange, as if holding something older than the foal itself. His body shook with every gasp, chest straining for air that would not stay. His skin glistened with cold sweat damp despite the chill. There was a beauty in him, uncanny and otherworldly, but also fragility so extreme that Ethan felt absurdly that to touch him would be to shatter him. He murmured aloud, barely aware Storm, a creature born of violence and silence, both caught between survival and surrender. Ethan dropped to his knees. The cold from the ground bit through his jeans, but he ignored it. He reached first for Blaze, laying a steadying hand against the torn neck. The skin was hot, fevered, the lips cracked and dry. He shifted, feeling Willow's flank just as hot, just as parched. Storm barely stirred at his touch, but the tremor beneath Ethan's palm told him what he needed to know. They were dying, all three, and fast. He jerked the canteen from his belt, unscrewed it with shaking fingers, and poured water into his hat. Cradling the makeshift bowl, he eased it toward Blaze's mouth. The foal's tongue flicked out rough and frantic, lapping what it could. Ethan pulled the hat back before it spilled, then tilted it toward Willow, who licked hesitantly, her dark eyes never leaving his. Storm was the hardest he barely swallowed, most of the water spilling down his chin. Ethan steadied the foal's head in his hand, tilting just enough for a few drops to pass. "Easy, easy," he whispered, voice raw. "I've got you now." The word startled him. He had not spoken in such a tone since his boy was alive. The memory came like a knife unbidden fever in a child's body, the panic of nights spent holding him, whispering for him to breathe. The memory of failure, of helplessness. Ethan's throat tightened, and for a heartbeat, he thought he would collapse beside these creatures, dragged under by grief. But then Storm twitched one mismatched eye, half opening, and that was enough to snap Ethan back. The wind rose, whistling down the creek bed, stirring leaves into a frantic dance. Dusty stamped above them, restless but waiting. The foals lay huddled, ribs heaving, yet each now fixed its gaze on Ethan. Not with fear alone, but with the faint pull of recognition, as if they knew somehow that he was the line between them and the void. He sat there, hat still damp, with water hands, trembling breath sharp in his lung. The prairie around him seemed to narrow to this one moment, this one choice. Everything that had once defined him, loss, silence, solitude, was pressed against something fragile, something that demanded to live. And in that collision, Ethan felt the walls he had built begin to tremble. For a long moment, Ethan could not move. He crouched in the dry creek bed, breath hanging white in the cold air, eyes fixed on the three fragile bodies before him. Blaze, Willow, Storm, he had already given them names in his mind, and with names came responsibility. They were no longer just animals, half hidden in dust and stone. They had become something else, something placed into his hands. He felt the truth of it pressing down on him like the weight of the sky. Slowly, he tugged at the buttons of his coat. The leather had been with him through 100 storms, scarred and stiff, smelling faintly of sweat and smoke. He shrugged it off, the cold biting instantly at his shoulders, and spread it flat on the ground beside the foals. His hands moved carefully, touching each in turn, fingers sliding along ribs and spines to find where pain lingered. Blaze flinched, but did not resist, eyes rolling wide. Willow's legs quivered beneath his touch, as fragile as kindling. Storm barely stirred at all, his head lolling against Ethan's palm with a shudder that cut straight through the man's chest. Dusty waited at the lip of the bank, a gray sentinel against the pale sky. The gelding shifted once, stamping a hoof, but otherwise stood patient, as though he understood the importance of what was happening. Ethan met the horse's gaze for a fleeting instant, then drew a breath so deep it burned his lungs. This was not a task he had planned for, not the kind of work he had risen to do this morning. It was something larger, something that would change not just the course of the day, but perhaps the course of his life. He started with Blaze. Sliding his arms beneath the foal's belly, Ethan lifted with all the strength he had, muscles burning from the strain. Blaze was heavier than he looked, ribs sharp, but body still carrying the stubborn weight of survival. The colt gave a hoarse cry, half protest, half surrender, then stilled as Ethan grunted and carried him toward the slope. Each step was careful, measured boots slipping on loose stone. When at last he laid Blaze across Dusty's saddle, the foal sagged, trembling, but did not fight. His eyes fluttered closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Next came Willow. Ethan knelt again, pulling the coat he had spread and wrapping it gently around her legs. The burns there made his stomach twist, raw patches, hair-singed skin cracked. He tightened the coat so the rough edges of the saddle would not scrape against her wounds. Then, as though lifting a child, he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones in fear. Her head pressed against his arm, eyes wide and wet. But when she caught sight of Blaze waiting above, she made a faint, rasping sound, a plea to be near him. Ethan climbed the bank, his breath coming harsh, and set her carefully beside Blaze. She shifted until her head rested against the colt's side, as though needing his warmth to keep breathing. Storm was last. Ethan looked at him and felt a chill deeper than the autumn wind. The foal's chest rose and fell with such difficulty that each breath seemed a battle he might lose. Kneeling, Ethan slid both arms beneath him, lifting as gently as possible. The body was limp, frighteningly so. And for an instant, Ethan feared he had waited too long. Then one mismatched eye flickered open, one blue, one brown, and for the briefest heartbeat, met Ethan's own. Something passed in that glance, something wordless and heavy, as though the colt were offering not just his life, but his trust. It shook Ethan to his core. He pressed Storm against his chest, holding him as though he were made of glass. Climbing the bank was harder this time. Every step felt like carrying the weight of his past, of every failure that had ever scarred him. But he made it. Dusty turned his head as Ethan approached, nostrils flaring, then stilled again as Storm was laid across the saddle with the others. Ethan pulled a frayed wool blanket from behind the cantle, spreading it over all three, tucking it in around their trembling flanks. For a moment, he stood there in the misty silence, his chest heaving, sweat dampening his brow despite the cold. He laid his hands on each of them in turn, Blaze's rough mane, Willow's fragile neck, Storm's damp brow. His voice came low, broken, more prayer than promise. "Easy now," he whispered. "You'll see another sunrise." The words hung in the air, fragile as breath. He knew they were meant for the foals, but part of him felt the echo inside, as if he were speaking to himself. A vow he had not dared to make in years, that life would not be allowed to slip away under his watch. Not again. Something inside his chest shifted a flicker of belief, where once had been only resignation. He had come to the creek as a caretaker of fences. He left it as the guardian of something infinitely more precious. Dusty shifted his weight ears, flicking back as though ready to move. Ethan tightened the reins and started forward. The trail back to the ranch was long and uneven, the path winding up from the creek bed to the open stretch of prairie. He walked beside the gelding hand, steady on the reins, keeping the pace slow so the load on Dusty's back would not jostle too harshly. Above them, the sky began to pale with the first hints of dawn. The foals lay quiet, bundled together beneath the blanket. Their breaths were shallow, broken now and again by small shudders, but they held on. The rhythm of Dusty's hooves was steady, like the ticking of a clock measuring out their fragile chances. Ethan listened to it with a kind of reverence, each step another second gained against the darkness. The wind swept over the grass, carrying with it the dry scent of hay and earth. Somewhere in that scent lay memory the afternoons he had once spent leading his little boy along a trail, teaching him to sit tall in the saddle, hearing his laughter echo against the hills. The memory rose unbidden, striking sharp. His hands clenched the reins tighter. He would not let another young life fade while he had strength to prevent it. By the time they crossed the wide stretch of prairie, it spilled golden light across the land, catching the edges of the blanket where the foals lay, making them glow as though wrapped in fire. Ethan looked at them then, at the horizon, and felt the strange certainty that this moment was more than coincidence. It was an omen, a call, a chance for redemption. He did not smile often, but a flicker of something almost like it touched his mouth. He kept walking Dusty's steady hooves, carrying them home, while the foals breathed faintly beneath the rising sun, a fragile procession, yet one that carried the promise of a beginning. The town of Silver Creek was still half asleep when Ethan guided Dusty down its lone main street. The lamps in the saloon had long gone dark, and only a faint curl of chimney smoke rose from Maggie Alvarez's cafe. The sky above was the pale blue of early morning cold and unforgiving, with frost clinging stubbornly to the wooden steps of every porch. At the very edge of town stood a squat wooden building with a faded sign swinging in the wind, Monroe Veterinary Clinic. The paint on the letters had peeled, leaving the word clinic barely legible. But a light glowed inside, warm and steady, spilling through the small square windows like a beacon against the chill. Ethan led Dusty to the porch, the old gelding's hooves thudding against the planks. He raised a fist and knocked once, twice, 3 times. Each strike echoed down the silent street, joined by the heavy sound of his boots shifting on the porch. A rustle came from inside. Moments later, the door swung open. Clara Monroe blinked in the doorway, her hair hastily tied back, a white blouse hanging loose over jeans tucked into scuffed boots. Her eyes were still touched by sleep, but when she looked past Ethan and saw the shapes on Dusty's back beneath the blanket, every trace of drowsiness vanished. "My God," she whispered, voice sharp with alarm. "They need you," Ethan said simply. His voice was steady, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the urgency beneath. Clara stepped aside, calling into the building as she moved. "Sam him, get the carts now." Inside the clinic was a patchwork of polished wood and the sharp tang of antiseptic. The walls were lined with shelves of bandages, bottles, and tools. Sam Carter, a young apprentice barely in his 20s, rushed in carrying a small stretcher and a crate of supplies. His eyes went wide at the sight of the blanket shifting with weak movement. "Careful," Clara ordered, already at Dusty's side. "We'll take them one at a time." They peeled back the blanket. Blaze stirred first, lifting his head weakly, his breath rattling in his throat. Clara's practiced hands moved quickly, checking gums pulse the raw rope burns around his chest. Severe dehydration, infected lacerations, she muttered. Sam iodine and bandages. Gauze pads now. Sam scrambled, fumbling a box. Blood welled from the reopened cuts as Blaze twitched and the boy paled. Clara's voice cut through his panic focus. Sam, hold steady. We don't have time for nerves. Together they laid Blaze on the stretcher, carried him inside, and set him gently on a padded table. Clara's hands moved in sure rhythms, cleansed dress wrap secure. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, hat clutched tight in his hands, feeling both rooted and helpless. Willow came next. Ethan himself lifted her down, wrapping her fragile body close to protect her legs. Clara's expression softened as she saw the burns running along her shins. Poor girl, she murmured. She rinsed the wounds with cool saline, the liquid hissing as it touched raw skin. Willow flinched violently, hooves striking at the air. But Ethan's steady hand on her neck calmed her. Easy, he said, low and rough, as if his voice could anchor her back to earth. Clara applied ointment, dressed the burns, and wrapped them in clean bandages. Then came Storm. Even lifting him from dusty Ethan felt how close to death the colt hovered. His chest barely rose, his eyes flickered mismatched colors, cloudy. Clara's face tightened. Get him to the oxygen mask, she snapped. Sam rushed forward with the tubing and the small canister hands trembling. Together, they eased the mask over Storm's muzzle. The colt gave a weak spasm, then settled, his breathing still shallow, but more regular. Clara inserted an IV line fluid dripping steadily into his thin vein. Heart's weak, she said grimly. We'll stabilize, but he's on the edge. Ethan's throat clenched. He stood close, hat twisting between his hands, watching as the colt shivered beneath the blanket Clara threw over him. For once, the man who had weathered blizzards and broken bones felt utterly powerless. All he could do was hold himself still while others fought for the lives he had carried here. The clinic grew quiet after the frantic first wave of work. The air smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. The foals lay side by side on padded tables, each covered in fresh blankets, saline lines running into their fragile bodies. Clara wiped her hands, peeled off her gloves, and motioned for Sam to fetch a kettle of warm milk replacer. She prepared bottles swiftly, attaching rubber nipples, testing the temperature against her wrist. She offered one to Willow first. The little filly trembled, but eventually latched, sucking weakly. Clara's face softened. Good girl, she whispered. Ethan exhaled a breath that he hadn't realized he was holding. Blaze was next. His burns were bound, his chest swathed in gauze. Clara pressed the bottle to his lips. At first he resisted, then his hunger overcame his fear, and he swallowed each gulp loud in the quiet room. Storm remained motionless, eyes closed. Clara hesitated, bottle in hand, then looked to Ethan. Try him, she said. Ethan stepped forward, setting his hat aside. He stroked the foal's sweat-damp mane, leaning close. His voice dropped to a whisper, "Come on, little fighter." For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then Storm's lips twitched, a faint flicker against the rubber nipple. With Ethan's hand steadying his head, he drew in a trickle of milk. Just a few drops, but enough. Ethan's eyes burned, though he said nothing. Clara, watching, gave him a glance that carried both surprise and something else, recognition perhaps, of the bond already forming between man and colt. When the bottles were drained, Clara stripped off her gloves and washed her hands at the sink. Her voice, when she turned, was firm, stripped of comfort. They're weak. Very weak. I can't promise they'll see morning. Ethan's gaze dropped to Storm, whose mismatched eyes now fluttered half-shut, breath still ragged. He didn't answer. Clara softened her tone. "But if anyone can keep them alive, it's you. I've seen how you are with Dusty. You've got the patience these foals need." The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the hiss of the oxygen and the faint shuffle of Sam cleaning instruments. At length, Sam cleared his throat voice, tentative, Dr. Monroe. "If they're wild, there might be more out there. Others didn't make it." Clara nodded gravely. "The burns the ropes. It's not an accident. They were hunted trapped. Whoever left them wanted them gone." Ethan felt something cold coil inside him, but his face stayed hard. He stepped to the tables, looking down at the 3 foals bundled beneath blankets. For a long while he said nothing, just laid his palm against Storm's trembling flank. Then he lifted his head toward Clara. "I'll take them back to the ranch. They need warmth and someone watching every breath." His voice was steady, but beneath it lay a steel she had not heard before. Clara nodded slowly. "I'll send you with fluids, antibiotic syringes. I'll write instructions. But it won't be easy." Ethan Bent brushed his hand over Blaze's rough mane, Willow's bandaged leg, Storm's damp brow. His voice was little more than a growl in his throat, but the words were clear. "I won't let them quit." Clara studied him, then said softly, almost to herself, "If you manage this, Ethan, you won't just be saving horses. You'll be saving yourself." The words struck deeper than she could have guessed. Ethan picked up his hat, settled it onto his head, and turned toward the door. Outside, the sky had brightened, but the chill of winter lingered in the air. He led Dusty forward, preparing for the journey back. Behind him, Clara watched her expression torn between worry and a fragile hope. By the time Ethan reached the outskirts of Silver Creek Ranch, the day had folded into dusk. The sky was painted with streaks of indigo and fading gold, the last scraps of light slipping behind the jagged line of the granite range. The wind cut sharper now, carrying with it the iron chill of oncoming winter. Each breath Ethan drew seared his lungs and poured frost into his veins. Dusty plodded up the familiar trail with quiet strength, the gelding's ears swiveling at every creak of saddle leather, every weak stir beneath the wool blanket strapped across his back. Beneath that cover lay the 3 foals, silent but alive, their breaths rattling against one another like fragile reeds in a storm. When the ranch finally emerged from shadow, it looked every bit the relic it had become: fences, leaning barn roof, dented yard scattered with brittle weeds. Yet tonight, the sight struck Ethan with something closer to relief than despair. Light glowed faintly in the cabin window and from the old oil lamp he had left on the porch. It was not much, but it was a promise of shelter, of fire, of a fighting chance. Dusty gave a low, throaty nicker as they passed through the gate, the sound echoing against the iron hinges that squealed in protest. It was almost as if the old gelding were announcing their return or welcoming the new lives he carried. Ethan swung down his body, stiff from hours on foot, and went to the blanket. Carefully he unfastened it, lifting each foal in turn. His hands moved slow, deliberate, every motion tuned to the knowledge that pain lurked in every bone and tendon of the small bodies. He carried them across the yard, one after another, through the yawning door of the barn. The barn had not been used in years, not properly. Dusty's stall was the only corner still swept and repaired. The rest was a museum of disused cobwebs and rafters dust thick enough to write in piles of straw, long since rotted into sour-smelling mats. Tonight it would have to serve as a sanctuary. Ethan set to work with a purpose he had not felt in a long time. He found the old broom leaning against a beam, bristles splayed and worn, but still fit to scrape filth. He pushed debris into the corners, raising clouds of dust that swirled in the lamp's glow. His throat burned, but he did not stop until a patch of floor lay bare. From the loft, he dragged down a fresh straw, dry and golden, shaking it loose until it spread into a soft, thick bedding. Next came the barrier. He scavenged planks from the stack near the wall, remnants of repairs long planned and never finished. With nails and a hammer, he built a crude pen against the back wall. The hammer rang out in the night, sharp and lonely, until at last a small corral took shape, not pretty, not strong, but safe enough to cradle 3 foals through their first night. When it was ready, he lifted Blaze inside, settling him onto the straw. The colt stretched his legs weakly, his sides still trembling. Willow followed her head, lolling against Ethan's arm, until she collapsed beside Blaze, immediately pressing her nose against his shoulder. Storm was last carried close to Ethan's chest, as though the man feared even the air might bruise him. He laid the colt gently down, then pulled the blanket Clara had given over, all 3 tucking it against their thin frames. He struck a match and lit the lantern that hung from the old iron hook. The flame flickered, then steadied, casting a pool of gold that softened the harsh corners of the barn. Shadows bent away, replaced by warmth. For the first time since he had found them in the creek bed, Ethan allowed himself to think this could work. This might be enough. But survival never comes easily. It began with Willow. The filly stirred at a sound, perhaps the scrape of a bucket, perhaps just the unfamiliar creak of the barn. Her eyes went wide, ears flat, body jerking upright in panic. She lashed out with a hoof, striking the tin pail Ethan had just filled with water. The crash rang like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Water spilled across the straw, darkening it to mud. Blaze startled, lurching half upright before sinking back, while Storm gave a weak gasp that froze Ethan's heart. He crouched quickly, lowering himself until his eyes were level with Willow's. She was trembling sides, heaving every muscle taut with fear. Ethan let his hands rest on his knees, palms open, voice dropping to a whisper. "Easy, girl," he murmured, slow as honey. "No one's gonna hurt you here." The words were not much, but the tone mattered. Willow's ears flicked, her breathing ragged but slowing. Inch by inch, she lowered her head, until at last she pressed her face against Blaze's shoulder again, drawing comfort from his nearness. Ethan exhaled softly, replaced the bucket further away, and refilled it. He watched in silence until her trembling stilled. He had expected panic. What he had not expected came minutes later. Storm lay apart, the rise and fall of his chest, irregular, too shallow, too quick. Ethan saw it immediately, his body reacting before thought. He knelt, pressed his palm to the colt's bony flank. Heat radiated from the fragile body, fever bright and dangerous. The foal's breath rasped, throat working, as though each inhale were fought from the claws of the dark. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. He grabbed a rag, dipped it in the bucket, and wrung it out. With gentle strokes, he wiped the sweat from Storm's neck, from his muzzle, from the star-shaped mark on his brow. "Breathe, little one," he urged, voice breaking against the quiet. "Just breathe." The colt shuddered. For one sickening instant, Ethan thought he would lose him. Felt that same icy helplessness that had drowned him years ago when fever stole the breath from his son. His chest tightened, memory colliding with the present until it was almost unbearable. He bent lower, one hand pressing a steady rhythm against Storm's side, as though willing his lungs to remember their task. Then slowly, a change. The spasms eased. The chest rose in a steadier pattern. The colt gave a long, trembling sigh and went still, eyes slipping shut. Ethan stayed crouched there, long after his back pressed to the wall, hand never leaving the foal's mane. He was afraid that if he moved, the fragile rhythm might falter again. The minutes dragged heavy with silence. His body ached, his eyes burned, but he held vigil, refusing to let the dark steal another life from him. The hours crawled. Rain began to patter against the tin roof, soft at first, then steady drumming like 1,000 small fists. Wind moaned through the gaps in the boards, rattling the lantern flame until shadows danced wildly across the walls. Still, Ethan kept his post. Near midnight, something shifted in the air. Not danger this time, but peace. Willow curled tight against Blaze, the colt draping his neck protectively over her. Storm, too, had inched closer, until he lay half beneath Blaze's chest, sharing warmth, his breathing still weak, but no longer desperate. The three had found each other, instincts stronger than fear. Ethan rose stiffly, legs trembling from hours of stillness. He gathered more straw, piled it around their small bodies, and tucked the blanket closer. The lamp flickered low, but held washing them in a circle of amber. For the first time in years, he felt something break open inside him. Not grief, not bitterness, but warmth. The barn still smelled of mildew and rust, and the roof still leaked in corners, but the sound of 3 steady breaths filled it with meaning no repair could buy. He sank down at the threshold of the pen, back against the wooden gate eyes, heavy. Rain hissed above wind, howled beyond the walls, but inside there was only quiet. His head dipped forward, hat brim shadowing his face, exhaustion pressing him down. And yet, his heart was lighter than it had been in a decade. For the first time since the night the mountain road had taken his family, Ethan Ward felt the faint stirrings of hope. Dawn crept over the mountains in a slow, golden seep, touching the world with the faint warmth of survival. Thin rays slanted across the peaks of the granite range, spilling through the cracks in the barn's roof until they landed on Ethan Ward's face. He stirred where he lay curled on a bed of straw, his back stiff, his coat drawn around his shoulders. For a moment he wasn't sure what had roused him. Not the wind, not the drip of last night's rain. Then he heard it. A low, cracked sound, half whicker, half cry, rising from the far corner. Ethan pushed himself upright, heart thumping hard enough to echo in his ears. The lamp on its hook had burned down to a stub, leaving only the faint light of dawn to guide him. He rose slowly, joints aching, and looked into the pen. 3 small forms shifted against one another. Blankets tumbled, straw rustled. And then Blaze, the chestnut colt with the fiery mane, raised his head and let out another ragged whinny, weak but defiant. Ethan exhaled sharply. Relief washed through him in a wave so strong he had to grip the stall rail to steady himself. They were alive. All 3 he watched as Willow blinked sleepy eyes and nestled closer to Blaze, while Storm gave a faint shiver and stretched his neck against the bedding. Their chests rose and fell, unsteady, but steady enough. The battle of the night had been won. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something lift from his shoulders, as if the silence that had weighed on him since his family's death had cracked enough to let in air. He leaned on the rail, whispered to no one but himself, "We made it through." Blaze showed his strength first. By mid-morning, when Ethan brought warm milk in battered bottles, Blaze was already stirring with restless energy. The moment Ethan pressed the rubber nipple to his lips, the colt latched on greedily. He drank fast, almost violently, gulping until milk foamed around his muzzle and dripped onto the straw. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Slow down, boy. You'll drown yourself." The colt pawed at the ground, eager, stubborn, and in a few days' time, he even tried to stand. His legs trembled like saplings in the wind, but with Ethan bracing his side, Blaze managed a few steps. He stumbled, collapsed, then surged again, determination burning behind his eyes. The rope wounds around his chest were raw, bandaged tight, yet he refused to bow to pain. Again and again, He pressed forward, forcing his muscles to remember their purpose. By the third attempt, he managed to stay upright long enough to plant himself squarely between Willow and Storm, as though declaring himself their shield. Ethan watched this with quiet recognition. "You're a fighter," he murmured. "And a guardian too." Blaze's spirit was reckless, yes, but in that recklessness, Ethan saw loyalty forming. Already the Colt angled his body to block the others whenever the door creaked or when wind rattled the rafters. His fiery mane fell into his eyes, and with every breath he seemed to insist, "I will not go down." Willow was a different story. She clung to Blaze, shadowing his every move. Where he stood, she stood. Where he lay, she folded herself against him, small frame pressed close, as if his body might shield her from everything cruel the world had offered. At first, she refused the bottle altogether. When Ethan crouched and held it out, she shrank back, ears flattened, eyes wide with fear. Her burnt legs shifted uneasily, every muscle poised to flee, even though there was nowhere to go. Ethan did not press. He sat down cross-legged on the straw, lowering himself until he was no taller than she was. He set the bottle near Hand-Loose eyes, steady but gentle. He stayed like that for minutes, breathing with her, letting the quiet seep in. Finally, curiosity flickered across her dark eyes. Her nostrils twitched. She stepped closer, trembling head low. Ethan tilted the bottle just enough. "Good girl," he whispered, voice soft, as leather worn smooth. "You're safe now." At last, she touched the nipple, tentative as a bird-pecking seed. Then she drank, hesitant, halting, but real. Her ears pricked forward, the fear not gone, but softened. Ethan kept his hand, still patience etched into every line of him. When the bottle was empty, Willow licked her lips and glanced at him once, quick and shy, before retreating back against Blaze's side. Each day she grew braver. The burns on her legs still made her wince. But when Blaze nudged her forward, she followed, limping a few steps at a time. Ethan began to see not just fragility, but the stirrings of resilience. She was like her name, a willow branch, thin and bowed, but not broken. Storm remained the hardest. The Colt rarely left the straw. His breathing stayed uneven, shallow gasps, punctuated by sudden jolts, as if nightmares shook him, even in waking. His mismatched eyes, one a pale blue, the other a warm brown, opened only rarely, yet whenever they met Ethan's gaze, the man felt a current pass between them. Something uncanny, something that told him this life was not ordinary. Storm drank little. When Ethan offered the bottle, sometimes he turned away, too weak to try. Other times he accepted only a few drops, lips barely moving. But even those drops mattered. Ethan stayed with him, holding his head steady, whispering encouragements meant for both Colt and man. "Come on, little fighter," he said. "Breathe, Storm. Breathe." Nights were the worst. Storm often woke with sharp, ragged breaths, eyes rolling as his body trembled. Ethan would rise from his pallet, kneel beside him, and press a steadying hand into his mane. He spoke into the dark, voice rough with memory. "Easy. I've got you. You're not alone." More than once, Ethan's mind betrayed him, pulling him back to the nights he had sat at his son's bedside, begging fever to break. The parallels nearly crushed him. Yet now, unlike then, he had a second chance. He could not let death take what little he had left to protect. The days blurred into a rhythm. Ethan abandoned his bed in the cabin entirely. Instead, he rolled a blanket out on the straw, sleeping beside the Foals so he could wake at the first sound of distress. He ate quickly, beans bread, black coffee brewed in an old pot, and saved his strength for them. At dawn, he cleaned their wounds, changed dressings, wiped sweat and dirt away. He warmed bottles of milk over the cabin stove and carried them carefully back to the barn. fetched fresh buckets of water, mended loose boards, and shoveled straw until the air grew thick with dust. By evening, his arms ached, but when Blaze nickered, when Willow took a brave step, when Storm managed a swallow of milk, it was enough. The ranch began to change subtly, but undeniably. Where once silence had ruled now, the barn echoed with the sounds of life, Blaze's impatient stomps, Willow's tentative whickers, Storm's fragile sighs. Ethan found himself listening for those sounds, marking his hours by them, clinging to them as proof that his efforts were not in vain. The man who had lived for years in the hollow of loss now found himself too busy for grief. He was caretaker nurse sentinel. And in the quiet moments when he sat watching three small bodies huddled together in the straw, their breaths mingling into one fragile chorus, he felt something stir in his chest. Not joy, not yet, but warmth, a seed of purpose planted in soil he had thought barren. That night, as wind hissed through the gaps in the barn walls and the stars burned cold above, Ethan sat with his back against the stall door listening. Inside, Blaze shifted, Willow sighed, and Storm's uneven breathing steadied into fragile rhythm. The ranch, for all its decay, no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed again, faint but real. And Ethan, for the first time in years, breathed with it. The days that followed brought a fragile rhythm to Silver Creek Ranch. Ethan grew used to the rustle of straw, the sound of Blaze's impatient whickers, Willow's tentative steps, Storm's uneven breaths. Each sunrise felt like stolen time, each night survived a victory. But peace on the Montana prairie never held for long. That evening, the sky lowered heavy, and dark clouds pressed so close to the earth they seemed to smother the stars. The air sharpened, filled with the scent of frost and iron. By the time Ethan stretched out on his makeshift bed of straw in the barn, the wind had risen, rattling the tin roof with restless fingers. Dusty shifted in his paddock hooves, clicking against frozen ground. The ranch felt wrapped in silence, too deep to trust. Ethan had just begun to drift, the day's fatigue dragging him towards sleep, when Dusty gave a low, uneasy nicker. The sound pulled Ethan upright, at once heart-thudding. Then came something older, wilder, a long, keening howl rolling down from the ridge. It was not the bark of a lone coyote. This was deeper, mournful, stretching across the valley like a cold blade. Wolves! The foals startled instantly. Willow shot up, eyes wide, a sharp, panicked cry bursting from her throat. She stamped her hooves into the straw, scattering it wildly, breath high and broken. Blaze spun, muscles, taut ears pinned, and planted himself between her and the open barn door, his fiery mane bristling in the lamplight. He stood trembling but firm, eyes flashing with defiance at a danger he could not see. Then Ethan heard a sound worse than the wolves, a weak gasp from Storm. The colt had jerked violently at the howl, as though the cry itself had reached inside his chest. His breathing grew frantic, shallow gulps that failed to fill his lungs. His legs gave out, and he collapsed sideways onto the straw body, convulsing. His mismatched eyes rolled white, and for an instant, Ethan thought he was watching life itself slip away. He was on his knees in a heartbeat, hands sliding beneath the foal's body. Storm's skin burned under his palms, heat soaked with terror. Ethan pulled him close, lifting him away from the cold earth, cradling him against his chest. "Stay with me, boy," Ethan rasped, voice breaking. "Breathe, Storm. Breathe." His hand pressed firm against the colt's narrow ribs, tapping a rhythm as though he could coax the lungs into remembering their work. Each second stretched agony, gnawing at Ethan's gut. His breath came, harsh sweat gathering at his brow despite the chill. Memories collided, the fevered body of his son in another lifetime, nights spent begging for breath that never came. His hands trembled with the weight of that ghost, yet he did not stop. "Not again," he whispered, forcing strength into his voice. "Not this time." Storm shuddered once, twice. Then a fragile exhale slipped from him, long and trembling. His chest rose again, uneven but real. The colt stirred mismatched eyes, flickering half-open, glassy but aware. Ethan bent his head low, pressing his forehead briefly against the damp curve of Storm's neck. "That's it," he whispered. "You're not leaving me tonight." The words were promise and defiance both. A sound broke through the night. Not wolves this time, but hooves against frozen ground. Ethan turned his head, still clutching Storm, and saw light weaving across the yard. A lantern swung from the saddle of a tall bay horse, its glow cutting through the dark. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice ragged but steady. The rider drew closer, the glow revealing a broad-shouldered old man with a silver beard and a weathered face etched by years of wind and dust. Caleb Ortiz, the rancher from the neighboring, spread, a friend of Ethan's father before age and time thinned their ties. Caleb dismounted slowly, boots crunching on frost lantern raised. "Heard the wolves," he said simply, voice low and calm. "Heard the ruckus too. Thought I'd best ride over." He stepped inside the barn, eyes adjusting to the lamplight. The scene that greeted him froze him in place. Ethan crouched on the straw, Storm, limp in his arms. Blaze braced like a sentinel before Willow, both trembling in the corner. The air was thick with fear sweat and the sharp edge of wildness. "Easy now," Caleb murmured, lowering the lantern. "It's just the night testing you." He moved with the careful pace of a man who had lived long enough to know sudden motions scared more than soothed. He reached for a pile of straw, spread it thicker near Ethan, and helped arrange it into a soft bed. Together they laid Storm down, covering him once more. Caleb's hands were steady as he pressed 2 fingers against the foal's side, gauging breath and pulse. When Storm's eyes flickered open, Caleb stilled. One eye caught the lantern's glow in icy blue. The other burned deep brown. For a moment, Caleb said nothing. His gaze lingered long and heavy. Something flickered across his weathered face, a recognition Ethan could not read. Later, when the wolves had gone silent and the foals had settled, Caleb lit a small fire in the iron pan near the wall. The flame snapped softly, sending curls of smoke into the rafters. He sat cross-legged on the straw lantern at his side, and after a moment, he began to speak. "You ever hear the old stories?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of memory. Ethan shook his head, still sitting near Storm, one hand resting on the colt's damp mane. "Back before your time," Caleb said slowly, "these plains belonged to a stallion, and they called Blackfire. A giant black as midnight, strong enough to break any rope they threw at him. He led the wild herds across Silver Creek Valley for near 20 years. Folks swore he was cleverer than men knew how to spring a trap. Without getting caught, knew where water ran, even when the earth was bone dry." He paused, feeding a stick into the fire. The glow flickered across his lined face. "Some called him a ghost, others a guardian. My own father told me of a blizzard worse than any we've seen since. A cowboy was trapped out there, lost in white death. And they say Blackfire stood over him all night long, taking the storm on his back until the searchers found the man alive at dawn. That's the kind of creature he was." Ethan listened, silent. The fire popped shadows dancing across the barn walls. One day, Caleb continued, Blackfire was gone. Maybe killed, maybe just vanished into legend. But the old ones always believed his blood still runs out there, hidden in the herds, waiting. His gaze turned toward Storm, lying weak but alive in the straw. Caleb's eyes lingered on those mismatched orbs, strange and mesmerizing in the lamplight. His voice dropped, almost reverent. Eyes like his don't lie. Blood runs deep, son. That colt carries the fire. Ethan felt the words settle into him like embers. He looked down at Storm, at the fragile chest still rising and falling under his hand. Half of him wanted to dismiss it as an old rancher's tale. Yet he could not tear his gaze from those eyes. They held something ancient, something burning. He drew the colt closer, silent, torn between disbelief and a weight he had not asked to carry. The night stretched on the howls, fading into the hills, until only the wind remained. Blaze, once rigid, lowered himself beside Willow, who pressed into him for comfort. Their breathing steadied. Storm, though weak, seemed calmer now, his head resting against Ethan's boot. Caleb Rose trimmed the lantern wick and poured fresh oil. He glanced at Ethan, his voice low but sure. "Keep them close," he said. "The land gave them to you for a reason." Ethan met the old man's eyes and nodded once. The words struck deeper than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of something greater than survival. An inheritance not of land or money, but of trust, of legend, of life itself. He sat back against the stall wall. Storm pressed close and listened as the barn filled with the slow, steady rhythm of breath. Outside, Montana's nights stretched endless and black, but within those walls something stronger than fear had begun to grow. Morning broke soft and pale, the kind of dawn that held its breath before winter descended in earnest. The light seeped slowly across the Montana plains, brushing the frosted grass with silver. At Silver Creek Ranch, the barn door creaked open, and Ethan stepped out, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He had not truly slept, only drifted in and out of uneasy dozes on the straw, but somehow he felt steadier than he had in years. Inside, 3 fragile chests still rose and fell. Blaze, Willow, and Storm had made it through another night. Blaze even lifted his head with a grunt, eyes bright with stubborn defiance. Willow blinked, half hidden behind him, while Storm lay still, breath uneven, but present. Ethan paused in the doorway, his gaze softening. He had expected to wake to silence. Instead, there was life. Fragile, borrowed, but life. A swell of relief filled him, tempered by the weight of responsibility. Survival meant another day of tending wounds, warming milk, and guarding against the wolves of both forest and man. As he filled a kettle with water and set it on the old stove to heat, a sound broke the morning stillness, the thud of hooves, and a woman's voice calling his name. He turned to see a mule plodding across the yard, its sturdy frame burdened with 2 wicker baskets. Perched astride was Maggie Alvarez, owner of the cafe in town, her scarf flapping in the wind cheeks, pink from the cold. She waved once before dismounting, landing with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life on rough ground. "I figured you'd forget to eat," she said, patting the mule's neck. She lifted one basket down and set it on the porch. Inside lay a stack of golden biscuits wrapped in cloth, a flask of fresh goat's milk, and a small sack of apples. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You didn't have to save it," and Maggie cut in gently. Her gaze drifted past him toward the barn. When she caught sight of the foals, her voice faltered. "Oh, Ethan." She stepped closer, peering through the doorway. The 3 colts lay bundled in straw and blankets, too thin, too battered, but alive. Compassion softened her features, but so did something else, determination. She turned back to him. "One man can't shoulder this alone," she said quietly. "If you want them to live, you'll need more than stubbornness. You'll need help." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. The old habits of silence, of keeping distance, rose strong. But Maggie didn't press. She set the baskets down by the door and smiled. "Biscuits for you, milk for them. That's all. No strings." Her tone was light, but her eyes lingered on his with quiet insistence. For once, Ethan found no retort. He simply nodded the smallest of gestures, but one that carried more than words. Maggie gave him a satisfied look, mounted her mule again, and rode back toward town. Ethan watched her go, then glanced down at the baskets. The knot inside him loosened just a fraction. For the first time in years, he felt the faint presence of someone at his side. By afternoon, the ranch no longer felt deserted. Word had spread through Silver Creek like sparks on dry grass. First came Gus, the town's carpenter, driving a wagon stacked with planks and nails. Behind him rattled the Patels, their cart piled high with fresh straw, the smell of hay sweet against the cold. Then the Pfizer brothers arrived on foot, lugging a coil of rope thick as a man's arm. "Where do you want it?" Ethan Gus asked Hammer, already in hand. Ethan blinked at the sight of them all. "I didn't ask. You didn't need to," Gus said simply, setting a plank against the fence. What followed was unlike anything Ethan had expected. Men and women spread out across the yard, voices rising with laughter and instructions. Hammers struck in rhythm boards, replaced sagging rails, nails bit into fresh wood. The Patels forked straw into the barn, piling it high until the musty odor of rot was gone. The Pfizers strung ropes, tightening supports, repairing hinges. At first, Ethan hovered torn between gratitude and resistance. For years, he had lived with silence, telling himself he needed no one. Yet when he looked at their faces creased with effort, lit with purpose, he found he could not turn them away. He lifted his own hammer, fell into step, and let the rhythm of work bind him to the others. The ranch changed before his eyes. The sagging barn roof was patched, the drafty walls tightened. A new stall rose its boards straight and strong, ready to hold warmth through the coming winter. Voices echoed in the air, mingling with the thud of tools and the sudden, rare sound of laughter on his land. The Foals watched it all. Blaze craned his neck above the stall door, ears pricked, eyes flashing at the clamor. Willow hesitated, peeking from behind him, then took a few timid steps into the straw, testing the air. Even Storm lifted his head, once his mismatched gaze wandering across the busy yard, curiosity flickering through exhaustion. For Ethan, it was a revelation. The ranch had not rung with such noise since his family was alive. For years, he had known only the whistle of wind through broken boards. Now the sound of hammers and the cadence of voices filled that emptiness. He stood with a nail between his teeth and a board under his arm, and for the first time, he felt part of something larger than grief. By dusk, the work was done. The townsfolk gathered their tools, loading carts and wagons, voices still carrying warmth despite the sheriff's warning. They offered quick farewells, promises to return, before disappearing one by one into the lengthening shadows. The ranch lay quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The barn walls stood straighter, the roof no longer gaped. Inside, the Foals lay in clean straw covered with fresh blankets. Their breathing was soft, steady, safe. Ethan sank onto the fence rail, watching the last glow of the sun fade behind the repaired boards. The lantern he had hung cast a golden arc across the yard, its light catching on new nails, new wood. For the first time, the ranch did not feel abandoned. It felt tended, shared, alive. He leaned back, exhaling a long, steady breath. For years, the burden had been his alone, his grief, a wall no one breached. But tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight shift. Not gone, not light, but shared. And in that sharing, something new stirred, the faint, unfamiliar warmth of belonging. The days passed with a tenuous steadiness. Blaze drank greedily, his wounds knitting under Ethan's patient care. Willow found the courage to take timid steps across the straw, limping but willing. Even Storm, though still weak, no longer fought every breath. For the first time since finding them in the dry creek bed, Ethan allowed himself to imagine that they might endure. It was on such a morning that Clara Monroe rode up the ranch trail. Her mare's breath steamed in the cold, and she swung down with her satchel slung over her shoulder. She found Ethan kneeling in the barn, checking bandages while the foals dozed. "They're stronger," she observed, crouching beside him. "Stronger than I dared hope." Ethan nodded, but his expression remained clouded. "We had wolves 2 nights back. Storm near gave up. Caleb Ortiz came, told me a tale about Blackfire." Clara raised a brow. "The old legend may be just that," Ethan said, stroking Storm's mane, "but I can't shake the feeling someone wanted these colts gone. And not just wolves." Clara studied him for a moment, then straightened. "Then let's find out. Take me to where you found them." They saddled their horses and rode north, the morning crisp and brittle frost still clinging to the grass. Dusty led with his steady gait, while Clara's mare picked her way along the narrow trail. Conversation was scarce. The quiet of the land weighed too heavily. The dry creek came into view, bleak and forgotten. The place still held the echo of that first night. Ethan could almost see their collapsed bodies on the stones, hear their rasping cries. Clara dismounted first, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. She crouched, eyes sharp, scanning the bed. There she murmured, pointing to the hardened mud. Grooves scarred the surface, deep twin ruts angling toward the tree line. Truck tires. Heavy load. Ethan followed her gesture, jaw tightening. He hadn't noticed before, too consumed by the foals themselves. Clara moved further, kneeling beside a dark patch of earth. She brushed aside leaves to reveal ash and cinders, faint but clear. Someone burned something here. Something. Documents, maybe evidence. She picked up a length of rope frayed at the end, stiff with dried blood. Her lips thinned, and this wasn't left by accident. Ethan's fists curled. So they dumped them here. Left them to die. Clara looked up at him, eyes grave. Not wolves, not chance. Someone wanted to erase what they'd done. The words hung in the cold air, heavy with accusation. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had known in his bones, but seeing the evidence made it real. The Foals weren't just survivors, they were witnesses. That afternoon, Ethan rode into town for supplies. He needed fresh straw salt blocks, anything to keep the Foals steady through the nights ahead. He tied Dusty outside the narrow shop on Main Street, its windows crowded with saddles and coils of rope. Inside, the smell of leather and oil filled the air. Behind the counter stood Mabel Jennings, her hair-streaked silver sleeves rolled to her elbows. She had been a widow for years, but her eyes remained sharp, her tongue sharper. As Ethan gathered salt and binding twine, she leaned forward. "Ethan," she said in a low voice, glancing toward the door. "I need a word." He frowned. "What is it?" Mabel stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "There's talk. Folks say Jeb Rollins lost a load." The name coiled in the air like smoke. Ethan's brows drew tight. A load of what? Not hay, not cattle. Mabel's voice grew sharper. "Foals. Wild ones. He's been running them south for years, selling to the slaughter yards, the fighting pits. This time, the patrol closed in. He ditched his truck and ran. But they say he lost 3. 3 colts." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. The coil of rope in his hand creaked as he tightened his grip. "Where did you hear this?" he asked, his voice low. "Doesn't matter where Mabel shot back. It's out there. And if Rollins finds out those 3 are breathing in your barn, he'll come." Men like him don't forgive loss, not when it costs them money. Her eyes searched his, fierce and unyielding. Be careful, Ethan. You brought life back to that ranch, but you've also painted a target on your door. Ethan stood frozen a moment, the truth thundering in his ears. The Foals weren't strays. They were stolen property in the eyes of a ruthless man. And property he knew was something men like Rollins reclaimed in blood. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he was riding into town again this time, straight to the sheriff's office. The building was small, built of weathered logs, the flag out front snapping in the wind. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and dust. Sheriff Tom Callahan sat behind a desk stacked with papers, his frame broad, his coat draped across the back of his chair. He looked up as Ethan entered, reading the resolve on the cowboy's face. "What brings you in so early?" Ethan set his hat on the desk. "I've got questions about Jeb Rollins." The sheriff's jaw flexed. He reached into a drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and spread it across the wood. Inside were photographs Rollins thick-set and sneering, his hair slicked back, his eyes mean. And beside him, 2 others. "That's Cole Callahan," said, tapping the image of a tall brute with tattoos snaking down his arms. Meaner than a rattler, muscle-bound, quick with his fists. His finger moved to the shorter man with a tangled beard and darting eyes. And Harris. Shifty. Likes the knife more than the gun. Both loyal to Rollins. Ethan studied the pictures, his stomach twisting. Callahan leaned back, expression grim. "We've been watching Rollins for years. He runs wild stock across the border, colts, mares, stallions, sells them to whoever pays. Fights, slaughter, you name it. Always one step ahead of the law. Evidence never sticks. Too many witnesses scared silent." He tapped the edge of the folder. "But if he thinks you're holding what's his, he won't ask. He'll take. And he'll use those 2 to clear the way." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked at the photographs again, at the hard faces of men who saw life only as profit. He thought of Blaze's hungry gulps, Willow's shy steps, Storm's trembling breaths. The thought of those lives in Rollins' grip filled him with a rage so sharp it startled even him. The sheriff's voice cut through. "If you mean to keep those colts, be ready. And when trouble comes, you send for me. You're not alone in this." Ethan met his eyes, the weight of the promise heavy between them. He gave a short nod, then turned and walked back into the light. The ride home was slow, Dusty's hooves crunching against the frozen trail. Ethan's thoughts churned with every step. He saw Blaze standing tall against Willow's trembling side, Storm's mismatched eyes staring at him with something deeper than fear. Horses. They called them horses like they were nothing but cargo, a load, a shipment. His grip tightened on the reins. No, they were not property. They were not a man's profit lost or found. They were life. They were freedom, wild and unbroken, and somehow fate had carried them into his care. The wind pushed against him, sharp with cold, but inside he felt a heat rising. It burned away the numbness he had lived in for years, melted the frost that grief had left behind. He leaned forward, speaking low to Dusty, though the words were meant for himself. "No one's taking them back. Not Rollins. Not anyone." The ranch appeared on the horizon, weathered and worn, but alive with sound. 3 foals waited inside, fragile but fierce, and Ethan knew clearer than he had ever known anything that this was no longer about survival alone. It was about standing against men who would turn breath into coin, against greed that stripped freedom from the land. This was a battle. His battle. The weather broke just after dusk. Clouds, thick and bruised, rolled down from the mountains, smothering the last traces of starlight. By the time Ethan finished his supper of beans and bread, the wind had risen to a howl. He lit 2 lanterns, checked the foals in the barn, and stepped back into the yard just as the first drops of rain slapped against the corrugated tin roof. Within minutes, the storm was in full fury. Water hammered the ranch, pouring off the eaves, turning the yard to mud. The barn glowed dimly, its single lantern throwing trembling gold across the rain-soaked dark. Ethan walked a slow circle around the outbuildings, the 12-gauge slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning every shadow. Inside the barn, the 3 foals shifted restlessly, their wickers carrying faint through the rain. Dusty stood guard along the fence line, his ears pricked and his body taut, catching something in the night that Ethan had yet to hear. Then it came a low rumble, not thunder, but mechanical rolling over the storm. He paused, every nerve sharpened. The sound grew clearer, heavy hooves mixed with the grind of tires on wet earth. Ethan's stomach clenched. Out of the curtain of rain emerged headlights, smeared yellow by the downpour. A black pickup truck, rust scarring its flanks, lumbered up the ranch track. It growled to a stop just short of the gate engine, idling like some beast ready to pounce. The driver's door creaked open. Jeb Rawlins climbed down, boots splashing into the mud. He was thick in the shoulders, belly pushing against his leather coat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. 2 figures followed. Cole, tall and broad tattoos crawling like vines down his forearms, swung a length of iron pipe with casual menace. Harris came next, short and bearded eyes, darting the butt of a pistol protruding from his belt. Rawlins slapped the gate with one meaty hand, the sound cracking even over the storm. His voice followed, slow and sure. "Evening, Ward. We've come for what's ours." Ethan stepped forward into the lamplight, rain streaming down his hat brim. The shotgun lay easy in his grip, though his jaw was set like stone. Rawlins grinned under the shadow of his hat. "Step aside, cowboy. 3 colts ain't worth your blood." From the barn came a faint whinny, Willow frightened by the voices. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Rawlins. His finger tightened on the shotgun stock. Before another word could pass, hooves thundered from the dark. A lantern swung in the night, throwing light across the mud. Caleb Ortiz reined in beside the gate, his weather-worn face grim above the glow. The old rancher dismounted in one motion, the smell of wet leather and horse clinging to him. A second rider followed close, Sheriff Tom Callahan, his duster-soaked revolver already in his hand. He stepped down and moved to the gate's shoulders, squared against the storm. Now the 3 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, Ethan in the center, Caleb to his right, the sheriff to his left. Against them in the driving rain, Rawlins and his men loomed like predators sniffing at a herd. Ethan's voice cut through the storm, low but carrying. "They're not yours. You left them to die." Rawlins tilted his head, raindrops dripping from the brim of his hat. "Everything on this land has a price. Those colts are mine, and you know it." The sheriff's revolver gleamed as he raised it a fraction. His voice was calm iron under the calm. "Law says otherwise, Rawlins. Step back before you make this worse." Cole shifted forward, iron pipe clenched, but Caleb's lantern swung higher, and the old man's eyes bored into him with the weight of generations spent on this land. For a beat too long, Cole hesitated. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Rain hammered the tin roof. Dusty snorted, stamping once the echoes sharp in the silence. Then Rawlins laughed. The sound was rough and cruel, cutting through the storm. He raised both hands in a mock gesture of surrender, the smirk never leaving his lips. "You boys win," the night he drawled. "But don't fool yourselves. This ain't over." He turned on his heel, signaling with a jerk of his chin. Cole and Harris followed, reluctant, but obedient. They sloshed back through the mud, climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, headlights slicing through the downpour as the vehicle reversed down the track. Rawlins leaned from the window, his voice booming one last time above the storm. "Those Colts will be mine, one way or another." The taillights glowed red through the rain, shrinking until they disappeared beyond the ridge. What remained was only the storm and the ragged sound of breathing from men who had not flinched. Sheriff Callahan holstered his revolver with a weary sigh. "He'll be back, Ethan. And next time he won't just knock on your gate." Ethan's gaze drifted to the barn where lamplight still glowed. He tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Then we'll be ready." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded, the weight of law and friendship in the gesture. Rain poured on, soaking them through. Caleb stepped forward, his hand landing firm on Ethan's shoulder. His voice was quieter now, but no less certain. "You stood your ground tonight. Blackfire's blood deserves no less." Ethan met the old man's eyes, then turned toward the barn. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The Foals stirred ears, flicking eyes wide. Blaze lifted his head high, Willow pressed close to him, and Storm lay curled beneath his mismatched eyes, reflecting the lantern light. Ethan stood over them, heart still pounding, rain dripping from his coat. For all the threats outside, the barn was warm, alive, filled with fragile breaths that meant more to him than his own. He whispered half to them, half to himself, "You're safe. I'll see to that." In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity tonight was only the beginning. The true battle between greed and freedom, between cruelty and the fragile hope of life, had only just begun. The rain had not yet dried from the earth when Sheriff Callahan called the town together. Word spread quickly after Rawlins's midnight visit to Silver Creek Ranch. By morning, men and women were already gathering in the sheriff's office, boots tracking mud across the wooden floor, the air thick with coffee and anger. Ethan stood near the back hat in his hands, Caleb beside him, Clara Monroe seated with her satchel of medical supplies on her lap. Callahan loomed at the center, shoulders broad, a rolled map spread across the scarred oak table. His voice cut steady through the murmurs. "Rawlins crossed the line last night. We've let him bully, threaten, and bleed this land long enough. It ends now." He jabbed a finger against the map. "His camp's here, Valley Edge, up against the pines. One road and one out. He's got Cole and Harris on watch, and he uses dogs and rifles to scare off anyone who gets close. Horses penned in that big shed he calls a barn." Clara's lips pressed thin, and inside that barn there'll be wounds and infections waiting. If we don't move soon, some won't make it. Callahan nodded. "That's why we strike fast. My deputies and I will take the gate. Draw their eyes, keep them busy. Caleb, you and your ranchers circle wide, break the locks on those pens. Ethan." His eyes found the cowboys. "I need you with the herd. You know how to calm them. They'll run themselves bloody unless someone's there to steady them." Ethan's throat felt dry, but he gave a single nod. Clara rose. "I'll prep the wagon. Blankets, bandages, IV lines. Whatever I can carry." The room filled with the creak of chairs, the thump of boots. Determination hung in the air like gun smoke. For the first time in years, the people of Silver Creek stood united, not as scattered ranches, but as a community with one voice. Dawn brought a shroud of fog rolling off the river. The world seemed muffled, as if holding its breath for what was to come. The posse moved quietly, hooves and tires crunching over damp earth. Ethan rode dusty near the front, reins loose, but heart tight. Behind him rattled Clara's wagon, covered with canvas filled with supplies that smelled of iodine and hay. Ranchers flanked them on horseback faces, drawn in silence. As the valley narrowed, the outlines of Rollins' spread appeared through the mist. A sagging barn, its roof patched with rusted tin, stood against the tree line. A faint yellow glow leaked from cracks in the boards. Then came the sound, high, brittle cries that sliced through the fog. Horses, weak, desperate, calling into the morning. Callahan lifted one hand. The group halted. He gave orders in a whisper, deputies on the gate. Caleb, take your men left. Ethan, you're with me until we breach. Stay sharp. They dismounted, boots sinking into wet ground. The air smelled of manure and smoke of sweat gone sour. From inside the barn came the muffled bark of dogs, followed by a man's voice, Cole cursing at something unseen. Another laugh followed, harsh and low. Harris. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He touched Dusty's neck once, grounding himself, then moved into position. The moment broke like a gunshot. Sheriff's Department Callahan roared, his voice splitting the fog. Step away from the gate, chaos answered. Dogs erupted in barking chains, rattling. Cole burst from the shadows, iron bar raised teeth bared in fury. Harris staggered from the porch, pistol in hand, eyes wild. For a heartbeat they froze, caught off guard by the sheer number of men arrayed before them. Then Cole lunged. Deputies met him head-on, one swinging the butt of his rifle, another grappling his arm. The iron bar clattered to the mud. Harris fired once, the bullet sparking off the gatepost, but Callahan's revolver was already leveled, his voice thunderous. Drop it, Harris. The shorter man hesitated, saw rifles trained from every side, and let the pistol slip from his grip. Deputies rushed in, forcing him to the ground. The commotion drew Rollins himself. The door of the ramshackle house banged open, and the man lumbered into the yard, face flushed, coat hanging open. His voice cracked with rage. You got no right here. This is private land. Callahan's revolver never wavered. Law's got every right when blood spilled on it, and you've spilled plenty. Behind them, Caleb and his men swung axes against the padlocked barn doors. The chains snapped with a sharp twang, the wood groaning as the doors crashed open. The stench hit, first urine, filth, sweat soured by fear. Then, the sight. Dozens of horses crammed shoulder to shoulder, ribs, jutting coats matted with blood and dirt. Some stumbled against the walls, eyes rolling white. Others stood trembling, patches of hair burned or shaved where ropes had cut too deep. A low chorus of cries rose, filling the morning air with misery. Ethan's chest seized. He pushed forward past Caleb, past the gawking ranchers, his hands lifted, palms open. Easy, he said, voice low, steady as bedrock. Easy now. You're safe. The horses surged back, panicked hooves striking wood, but one, a massive black stallion chained at the far end, struggled against the iron, eyes wild. Blood trickled down his forehead where the chain bit skin. Ethan stepped toward him, slow, murmuring under his breath. I've got you. No more chains. The stallion bared his teeth, ears flat. Ethan kept moving until he was close enough to touch. He laid his hand on the trembling neck, feeling the heat, the quiver of fear. For a moment, the horse resisted, muscles coiled tight. Then something shifted. The stallion's head lowered, eyes softening just enough. With a grunt, Ethan pulled the bolt free, and the chain fell. The horse staggered forward into the light, nostrils flaring, but he didn't charge. He stood beside Ethan, towering and broken, yet beginning to trust. Behind them, the law closed in on Rollins. Deputies dragged Cole and Harris to their knees, irons snapping shut around their wrists. Rollins bellowed, spittle flying. These horses are mine. You can't prove a damn thing. Callahan strode toward him, revolver lowered but ready. We've got witnesses. We've got evidence. and we've got the word of every scar on these animals." Clara emerged from the barn, her hands already bloody with work, her voice cutting like steel. "I'll testify to every wound, every infection. These animals were starved, beaten, burned. And you're the one who did it." Rollins swung at the nearest deputy, but 3 more piled on. His arms were wrenched behind him, cuffs clamping with a metallic snap. He roared, thrashing, until Callahan himself shoved him against the porch rail. "This is over, Rollins," the sheriff growled. But Rollins twisted his head, eyes blazing. "Over, you think a cage'll stop me? This town will pay for this. You hear me?" The words echoed across the valley, swallowed by the cries of the freed horses. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the yard was filled with people. Word had spread, neighbors, townsfolk, even children clutching blankets had come. They pressed close, handing water buckets, tossing hay into the pens, hastily rigged from fencing. Some wept openly at the sight of the emaciated animals staggering into the light. Maggie Alvarez pushed through the crowd, her apron damp with rain. She caught Ethan's hand, squeezing hard. "You did the right thing. We all did." Ethan looked around. It was true. Men and women alike moved with purpose, binding wounds, whispering comfort, working together. The land that had once seemed divided now pulsed with unity. By afternoon, the Silver Creek Gazette had a man on site scribbling furiously in a wet notebook. By evening, the story was already spreading beyond the valley. On Main Street, townsfolk gathered, voices raised in outrage. Hand-painted signs appeared in windows: "Protect the wild horses. End the trade." For the first time in decades, the town's fury was not directed at one another, but outward at the cruelty that had scarred their land. When the last horse was led to safety and the last deputy wagon rolled away, Ethan stood in the churned mud, exhausted but unyielding. Blaze Willow and Storm would sleep tonight in fresh straw, but beyond them stretched a herd, wounded, battered, yet alive. And in their survival, Ethan felt something stirring. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was proof that even in a land hardened by storms, mercy could still blaze like fire. Snow clung to the stone steps of the Missoula County Courthouse, crunching beneath the boots of every man and woman who climbed toward the double doors. The town of Silver Creek had turned out in force, ranchers in heavy coats, mothers clutching shawls against the wind, even children whose breath fogged in the frosty air. The headline of the morning paper was already plastered across the walls and newsstands: "Rollins, horse trader of infamy, faces justice at last." Inside the courthouse buzzed like a hive. Reporters scratched furiously in their notebooks, flashes from cameras popping like tiny bursts of lightning. The benches were packed, shoulders pressed together, faces flushed with anticipation and anger. For the people of Silver Creek, this was more than a trial. It was the day their valley's darkest shadow might finally be lifted. At the defense table sat Jeb Rollins. He filled the chair with his bulked jaw jutted forward, eyes hard as flint. A slick-suited lawyer sat beside him, whispering advice, adjusting files, trying to project calm. But Rollins's impatience was plain. His thick fingers drummed a steady, aggressive rhythm against the wood. The bailiff called for order, and the room stilled as the judge entered, robes sweeping. "This court is now in session," the voice rang. And with that, the clash of greed and justice began. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Clara Monroe. She walked to the stand in a simple blouse beneath her winter coat, her hands steady, her eyes unwavering. Ethan, sitting on the witness bench, felt a swell of pride. As she raised her hand, swore the oath, and faced the jury. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Dr. Monroe, tell the court what you observed when these animals were first brought to you." Clara's voice carried clearly. They were near death. All 3 colts dehydrated to the point of collapse. Blaze had rope burns around his neck and chest so deep, the flesh was raw. Willow's legs were scorched with burns, skin blistered, hair singed. Storm's lungs were failing, his heartbeat weak. Without intervention, they would not have survived the night. Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor guided her through photographs pinned to boards, close shots of Blaze's torn hide. Willow's scarred legs, Storm's heaving chest beneath oxygen tubing. Each picture drew audible murmurs, heads shaking in disbelief and fury. Clara pressed on her tone, sharp as a scalpel. These wounds were not accidents. They are consistent with deliberate binding neglect and exposure to heat and chemicals. And when deputies raided Mr. Rawlins' property, they found matching rope fibers, chains, and burned refuse. The injuries aligned precisely. Across the room, Rawlins shifted his face, mottling red. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but the damage was done. Clara's words hung in the air like hammer blows. When she stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with indignation. Men muttered curses under their breath. Women dabbed at their eyes. Rawlins sat stone-faced, but the steady drumming of his fingers had ceased. The next hours brought more voices of the valley. A rancher described the moment the barn doors burst open at Rawlins' camp. His voice shook as he painted the scene of skeletal flanks, eyes rolling white sores crusted with blood. They weren't animals anymore, he said. They were ghosts. Maggie Alvarez followed, her apron still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. She spoke not of chains or wounds, but of what came after, how neighbors had carried hay ropes and planks to Silver Creek Ranch, how the Foals had become more than victims. We all saw what Rawlins saw them, as she said, voice rising. Cargo, coin. But when Ethan opened his gate, we saw what they really were. Life, and life's worth fighting for. Sheriff Callahan took the stand, his broad shoulders dwarfing the witness box. He laid out the facts like fence posts, in solid earth photographs of tire tracks, reports of seized chains, sworn statements from deputies who seized Cole and Harris. His voice carried authority that no defense could shake. When he finished, the courtroom was no longer restless. It was unified breathing as one body leaning toward a verdict that felt inevitable. Finally, the bailiff called Ethan Ward. He rose slowly, hat in his hand, boots heavy on the worn floor. He looked every inch the cowboy, tall weathered coat patched at the elbows, the lean frame of a man built from long days and lean winters. He swore the oath, then settled into the witness chair. The defense lawyer rose, voice oily smooth. Mr. Ward, you claim these colts came from my client's property? Do you have documentation to prove they belong to him? Ethan's eyes narrowed. He spoke low, but every word cut. The proof is that he abandoned them, left them to die in a dry creek. You don't need papers to see cruelty, the lawyer pressed. But without ownership records, can you say for certain I don't need records? Ethan cut in, voice sharpening. I saw the ropes. I saw the burns. I saw what was done. The defense faltered, trying to redirect, but the jury's eyes were already fixed on Ethan. The prosecutor stepped forward. Mr. Ward, she asked gently, do you have anything to say to this jury? Anything to leave them with as they consider their verdict? Ethan turned in his seat, meeting the faces of ranchers, laborers, mothers, and fathers who filled the jury box. His voice was rough, scarred by years of silence, but it carried a clarity that stilled the room. They are not property, he said. They are freedom, and freedom deserves to live. Silence fell like snow. No cough, no shuffle, only the sound of the courthouse clock ticking. Then a ripple began, soft murmurs, nods, the glint of tears in weathered eyes. A woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. A man lowered his head, overcome. The lawyer sat down, defeated. Ethan returned to his bench, heart thudding, but The weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Days passed as arguments wound on evidence stacked higher, but nothing could eclipse the testimony that had seared itself into the town's heart. When the jury filed back, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty, the foreman declared. The judge's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Jeb Rollins, you are hereby sentenced to a term of no less than 20 years in federal prison for the unlawful capture, trade, and abuse of wild horses. You are furthermore prohibited for life from owning or dealing in livestock of any kind. A roar filled the chamber, not from Rollins, though he fought against his cuffs, bellowing, "This town will regret it. You'll all regret it, but from the people of Silver Creek." Applause, shouts, tears. Cole and Harris, already convicted to lesser but heavy terms, were dragged away. Their faces twisted in rage. Rollins' curses were swallowed by the clank of irons. Outside, the courthouse steps became a celebration. Reporters snapped photos of raised hats of women clasping hands of banners, hastily painted Silver Creek stands for the wild. Ethan slipped through the crowd, his hat pulled low, finding a moment's quiet under the courthouse eaves. Clara found him there, her cheeks pink with cold, her eyes softer than he had ever seen. "We did it," she said simply. "They'll never take them again." Ethan nodded, his gaze lifting toward the north. Snow clouds drifted low across the mountains, and in his mind's eye, he saw the silhouettes of Blaze Willow and Storm galloping free across the prairie. For the first time in years, his chest loosened. Justice had been served not just for 3 foals, but for every wild heart that had ever thundered against the cruelty of chains. In the weeks after the verdict, the talk in Montana cafes and feed stores wasn't just outrage, it was momentum. Newspapers ran photos of Blaze Willow and Storm with captions like, "The 3 flames of Silver Creek." School kids taped drawings of wild horses to classroom doors. On a wind-bright morning, Dr. Clara Monroe stepped from her truck at Silver Creek Ranch and waved as a second vehicle rolled in behind her, white with the emblem of a fir tree and a running elk painted on the side. A woman climbed out wearing scuffed field boots and a wool coat. "Clara Winslow," she said, offering a hand that had calluses instead of polish. "Northwest Wildlife Trust." She squinted across the winter-stubbled pasture to the sagging fence lines and weather-silvered barn, then to the smaller patch shed where 3 young lives had outlasted the worst a man could do. "You've got space," she said. "And a story. We'd like to help you turn both into a future." Ethan stood just outside the barn door, hat-low hands tucked in his coat. Help how Winslow set a folder on the tailgate and flipped it open. Floor plans, budgets, sketches of quarantine pens, a vet room turnout paddocks with windbreaks. "We fund rural sanctuaries where there's a need and a community willing to carry it. You have both. Silver Creek Sanctuary, rescue, rehabilitation, and whenever possible, release." Ethan studied the drawings. The lines looked too clean for his battered place. He thought of winter chores, busted pumps of nights on straw with Storm's breath, fogging in the cold of mornings. He'd wondered if he was a fool for hoping. "I'm one man," he said at last. "This ranch barely stands as it is." Winslow's gaze was steady, kind, without softness. "You won't be one man. Not anymore. We stake the seed. Your town grows it. This won't just be your work, it'll be their work." He looked past her to where Blaze nosed Willow in the sunlight, and Storm lifted his strange, beautiful eyes to the pale sky. He heard himself exhale. "Let me think." That night he carried a lantern into the barn and set it low. The 3 foals lay close, Blaze sprawled like a young king. Willow tucked small beside him, Storm curled with his nose in the straw. Ethan crouched and listened to the slow tide of their breathing until the lamp hissed and settled. He remembered the hush of the courtroom after his words had left his mouth and become something larger than him. They are not property. They are freedom, and freedom deserves to live. He touched the old scar on Dusty's flank as the gelding leaned over the stall door, breathing hay and patience. "What do you think, old boy?" The horse blinked, unconcerned by human dilemmas. Ethan smiled small, real unforced. He looked back at the three at the life he hadn't expected and nodded to no one and to everyone. "All right," he said into the warm dark. "We'll build it?" The next morning, the ranch woke like a stage at curtain. Trucks rattled up the drive. Gus the carpenter unloaded timbers and a crate of new hinges. The Patels backed a long trailer to the barn and flipped the hatch on neatly stacked bales. The Pfizer twins slammed steel post drivers into frost-hardened earth until their breath came in white bursts. Maggie Alvarez arrived on a sure-footed mule with 2 wash tubs, one full of chili, one full of cornbread, and clucked everyone into eating as if that too were part of construction. Children sprinted the fence lines with twine and paper flags, inventing jobs where none existed. Sheriff Callahan rode in at mid-morning, signed a clipboard, and left 2 deputies to escort the first transport of rescued horses that would come from counties farther west. "We'll put a car on the road for the next few weeks," he told Ethan. "No one's stealing hope off your property." Clara set up a tiny clinic in the lee of the main barn. 2 cots, a metal cabinet of supplies, a hot plate for water, a chart pinned to the wall with names in bold, careful print. "This will do," she said, smoothing the paper like a blessing. "We'll grow as we need." She taught Maggie to wrap a fetlock. She taught the Pfizers to read gums for hydration. She taught Ethan how to watch a rib cage and know when fear, not illness, was the problem. Caleb Ortiz walked the perimeters in the afternoons, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, offering a lifetime's worth of small solutions. "Don't turn them out hungry," he warned, "or the grass will turn to panic under their feet. Let them smell wind with hay in their bellies." He showed Ethan how to move through a nervous herd without touching a single flank and still part it like water. He told the children stories of the old bands that threaded these hills long before any fence post stood, and the kids listened and didn't fidget, because Caleb's voice made you stand up straighter inside your own skin. Nails rang and sawdust spun in the pale sun. The sound of work braided with the bright clamor of life, the knickers of new arrivals, the laughter of teenagers figuring out which end of a shovel was honest labor, the scrape of Maggie's ladle on the bottom of a pot. Silver Creek Ranch, once a map of quiet repairs and private grief, became a crossroads. The place breathed. Through it all, the 3 foals moved as if their bodies remembered a promise. Blaze took first steps into the half-acre turnout. Tail flagged, then bowed back to nudge Willow across the threshold. Willow, whose shadow once flinched at the scrape of a spoon, walked among women and children and let small hands trail like leaves along her neck. Storm, still thinner than he should be, climbed the mound of old earth by the new fence and stood there like a question mark becoming an exclamation point. His forelock tossed, his heterochromatic gaze bright as flint and river water. When he looked down at Ethan, Caleb murmured, "Blood runs deep," and no one argued. They started calling the trio the 3 Flames of Silver Creek. It stuck because it fit, because something in people wanted a name for what they were building, not charity, but continuum, not pity, but kinship. When strangers used the phrase in town, Ethan would duck his head, uncomfortable with attention, and then later out by the fence with Dusty, he'd admit to himself that pride could be a clean, useful warmth. His life changed without becoming something foreign. He still woke before light and checked hooves by feel. He still mended hinges that had given up in the night. But the center had shifted. He was alone, only if he chose to be. There were hands at his elbow when a post leaned wrong laughter over the tool bench, when a bolt refused to thread voices at dusk that carried across the pasture. One evening, as lanterns blinked on along the fence line and steam rose from the chili pot, Maggie leaned against a post beside him. "You see it, don't you?" she asked, chin tipping toward the yard. "This place isn't just yours anymore. It's hope for all of us." Ethan watched Willow thread between two kids and stand trusting while they read the brass nameplate on the new stall door. "Yeah," he said the words soft with certainty. "And I think I'm ready to share it." The last morning of late fall arrived slow and deliberate, as if not to startle anything. Frost silvered the grass. A thin skein of mist lay gathered in the low places, and then with the first reach of sun over the bitterroots began to lift. Light fell like honey along the new fence rails. Somewhere, a meadowlark misread the season and tried a soft bar of song. Ethan leaned on the fence Maggie's brothers had planed and sanded and set each board straight, each nail sunk flush. Dusty dozed at his shoulder, whiskers twitching gray mane lifting in the light breeze. The air was clean as a bell tone. On the farther pasture, Blaze broke first. As always, he tore into a gallop with a joy that had no audience and didn't require one. His mane struck sparks from the sun. Willow followed, not because she had to, but because it pleased her now to choose motion. Her stride had lengthened. Her line had become more willow and less reed. And Storm gathered himself, hesitation shivering away like an old skin, and launched. His hooves thundered, his lungs worked, and his eyes, one blue, one deep brown, caught the light, so that even the fence posts seemed to hold their breath. The sound of them came up through the ground, up through Ethan's boots, and into his bones, 4-beat, 4-beat, the old alphabet of the prairie. Wind moved across the grass in a long, low chord. He had known noise that was nothing but threat, the crack of a chain, a door kicked open in a storm. This was not that. This was music, and he stood inside it. He didn't notice Sheriff Callahan until the horse and rider were shadows beside him. The sheriff swung a leg over and stepped down the boards, creaking a little under his weight, the leather of his coat sighing. For a long minute, they simply watched the pasture. Two men whose lives had been built on saying less than they felt. Finally, Callahan held out his hand. Ethan took it, the shake firm, uncomplicated. The sheriff's voice was low. "You didn't just save 3 foals," he said, eyes on the herd. "You saved a piece of this land." Ethan squeezed back, then let go. He tipped his chin toward the turnout, where half a dozen new rescues moved like shadows beside their brighter kin. We all did. Behind them, the parking area filled up, one quiet vehicle at a time, townsfolk who had come not to gawk, but to witness. They lined the fence a respectful distance apart, Maggie with a thermos, Clara with a stethoscope looped in her pocket hair in a practical knot, Caleb with his hat in both hands and an expression like a man counting blessings and livestock in the same column. There was no ceremony, only presence. The valley seemed to stand a little taller. On the small rise near the north gate, Storm surged ahead of the others and stopped. The wind lifted his forelock. His mane snapped like a standard. He cocked an ear toward the fence line, then toward the mountains and the open ground the sanctuary would someday give him back. He threw up his head and called a clear, ringing neigh that leaped into the fence, crossed the frosted swale, touched the pines, and came back richer for the echo. Ethan felt it land in him. Storm's mismatched gaze found him just a flicker of recognition, a silent relay tossed from one life to another. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't even gratitude. It was acknowledgement the way wild things offer it. I am what I am because you chose to stand your ground. Blaze and Willow swept past and circled their bodies, curving in around storms like punctuation around a promise. Children cheered. Someone wiped at their face and pretended it was the wind. The sheriff nodded to no one as if a ledger had balanced somewhere beyond paper. Maggie slid a mug into Ethan's hand and left him to the view. Clara leaned her elbows on the top rail and exhaled the breath, turning to a ghost and then disappearing. The sun pushed higher and the mist thinned to nothing. The three that had once been a tangle of fear and ribs were now part of something wider, part of a herd, and beyond that part of the ongoing story of a place. The sanctuary's sign, hand-carved cedar, would go up next week. The grants and the schedules and the case files would multiply. Winter would bring difficulties, and spring mud would swallow more than one boot. But right now, there was only this hooves on frozen ground, breath like smoke, the uncomplicated work of living. Ethan set his hand on Dusty's warm neck. The old gelding shifted his weight and leaned back, a quiet exchange that had nothing to prove. Out beyond the fence, Storm lifted his head one more time and shouted joy into the open day. "Run free," Ethan murmured, voice not much louder than the breeze. He tasted the words and didn't hurry them. "This land is yours again." The herd broke and stretched into the morning, with their shadows long on the pale grass, the sound of their going stitched into the fabric of the valley. Ethan stood and watched until the pounding became a memory, and even the memory felt like a beginning.